Brought to you by RBD Instruments.
This video will show you how to reassemble the 04548 X-ray source. In this case, we've removed the filament feed through so that we could clean the high voltage ceramic that isolates the anode. So we're going to replace the feed through that also has the 4 filament couplers on it. First we're going to use a new gasket, and we're going to make sure that the couplers face forward towards the end of the tube. We'll want to use some anti-seize compounds such as Loctite C5A on the bolts, and we're going to put those in just finger tight initially because we're going to want to check the spacing of the couplers with respect to the inside of the tube. We want to maximize the distance between the couplers and the anode. So to do that, you may have to adjust the spacing on these couplers so that they come up or down slightly, so that once you look at them from inside of the tube, they're hugging the wall of the tube. That will give you the maximum distance. See, here it shows where the couplers would be if you're looking down from the tube. You want to maximize that distance to prevent arcing to the anode. Assuming that you have not needed to remove your filament feed through, the first thing you're going to want to do is install the football ceramic. So you're going to slide this down the inside of the tube, and you'll have to work it back and forth. It's a fairly tight fit. And fact is, with the new ceramic, you very often need to get a small file and file the edges to round the edges a little bit on the moly pieces in the filament ceramic so that it'll fit in. It's going to be tight. What you want to do is you want to work it back and forth, slide it down until you can get the 2 holes that are in the moly standoff part of the football ceramic to line up with the holes inside of the tube as shown here. Once you get those close, you're going to want to use your OT 80 tool to screw into the retaining pins for the moly blocks that fit into the football ceramic. These are the small stainless steel pins. There's a view. And you just kind of work it back and forth. You line the hole up, get the thing started, and just work the pin back and forth, applying pressure. Sometimes you may need to tap it. You can use any OT 80 screw, or if you don't have a screw, you can also order these parts that we use here. These are actually standoffs from a 04303 ionizer rebuild, and we use those because they work real well. You can order those when you order any of the parts that you need for your X-ray source. Alright, we have installed the football ceramic. The next step is going to be install the moly block. Installing the moly block is very similar in that you have to work it back and forth. It's always a tight fit. If it's really tight, you can use a little isopropanol as a lubricant. Here we're using a needle nose pliers to work it down. Sometimes you need to do that. You want to be careful because the moly block is fairly brittle. You don't want to crack it. Okay, here we're using the beryllium copper retaining pins. It's the same thing. You line up the block to where the holes are matching in the tube, and then you press in the retaining clips until they're flush, and then unscrew the screw. And here we're showing all 4 of the pins have been installed, and we have our football ceramic and moly block installed. You can get all the parts for these X-ray sources by going to our website at rbdinstruments.com. Go to Parts, and then Optics Replacement Parts. Now that the moly block and football ceramic have been installed, the next step will be to install the new filaments. The first thing we do with new filaments is we're going to want to cut the wires to the same length as the old filaments. The best way to do that is to, with the old filament laying down on the table, is to put a new filament right next to it or right on top of it so that you can be sure to cut the wires the exact same length or slightly longer. What you need to be careful of is to make sure that one wire is longer than the other. Make sure that you match that on the ceramic. If you cut the wrong wire in the wrong length, you will not be able to use the filament. So that's very important. So you can just lay the filament down and just estimate it fairly close and put it slightly longer if you want to, or you can actually slide the ceramic on, as Dustin's doing here. Slide the ceramic off the old filament and onto the new filament, and then cut the wire the same length as the previous filament wire was. Typically they stick out past the ceramic about 1/4 of an inch. You want to be careful when you're handling the filaments because they're coated with yttria, and it's a very fine powder. You don't want to be scraping it or bumping it, it'll fall off. We want to keep that on there so that when the filament gets activated that it bonds to the filament. So take your time. There's no rush here. You don't want to cut the wire the wrong length. You don't want to damage the filament. Alright, once you get those cut, you slide the filaments carefully down the tubes, which are the holes in the moly block. You'll have the filament, the white ceramic tube that slides over the filament, and then there are some metal shields that slide over the ceramics. All those slide down, and you have to carefully use a dental tool or a needle nose pliers, and what you want to do is guide those wires into the couplers. The couplers are loose to allow the wires to pass through the center of the couplers. You have to apply a little pressure on the ceramic part of the filament to do this. It's a little springy. Once you finally get those wires to slide all the way through, you're going to want to install the filament retaining pin. So you push that down a little bit. The pin pushes in, and then you unscrew it. Unscrew the OT 80 screw. And now what you have is you've got the filament installed and the wires are pushing on the back of those couplers. So you want to go in there and you want to hold a needle nose pliers on the coupler while you use your 0448-4 Bristol tool to tighten the set screw. You want it to be snug. Don't try to twist it off. Just make it. You'll feel it. It's kind of, the copper is soft, so as you tighten it, you'll feel it, the pressure increasing, and you want it to be fairly snug. Here we see the installed filament wires into the couplers. You notice that the top coupler has a little bit of an angle to it. You would want to use a needle nose pliers and twist that a little bit to straighten it out so that it's parallel. That will maximize the distance between the couplers and the anode. If your anode is dirty, you can use a wire brush and very lightly clean it. The coating on the anode is only about 10 microns thick, so you want to use a very gentle touch. Now we're ready to install the anode. You notice that the exit of the anode, the one that's bent for the water exit, that normally goes away from the filament coupler. So it faces opposite of the filament coupler. On most installations. On some installations it goes the other way. We slide the anode in all the way up to the football ceramic, after of course installing a new gasket. There should be just a little bit of spring on this anode. So once it gets installed, you can turn it upside down, and if you let go of the anode, it should spring up slightly, like maybe as much as a 1/16 of an inch. If it's holding flat, that means that the anode needs to be adjusted, because the anode needs to be firmly seated into the football ceramic to where it sticks out past the end of the moly shield. And if it doesn't, what you have to do is you have to stretch the anode slightly, as shown here. You pull it just a little bit, not very much. A little bit of a pull, and then you put it back in, and then hopefully you'll see that the anode sticks out past the football ceramic, but also that there's a little bit of spring on the anode. If you let go, it'll pop up and there'll be a little bit of a gap. And sometimes it's a little difficult to line it up, the end of the anode into the football ceramic, so if you hold it upside down and look at it, you have a better chance of positioning the anode. Once it gets past the football ceramic, it should seat all the way up. And here we see the anode coming up through the football ceramic. There we go. And now if you notice, there will be just a little bit of a gap. See, he pushes that down. it springs back up. Alright, that means it's correct. Now we can install the 6 cap head screws to the anode, and again you would want to use some anti-seize compound on the end of those if they're dry. I usually go in a clockwise rotation rather than crisscross, just slightly increasing the amount of torque on each pass. Go until it's flange to flange, if you can. Sometimes you can't get flange to flange. The final part of the process is to install the new X-ray window. The purpose of the window is to suppress electrons in the source area but allow the X-rays to pass through. If you do a lot of sputtering, the window is going to become heavily coated, and that's going to cut your counts down. So you want to replace the window on a regular basis, typically once a year, sometimes more often depending on the amount of sputtering that you do. I'd recommend that you practice with the old window before you put the new window in, just to get the hang of it, because one slip and you put a hole in this window, you have to replace it. So be very, very careful to drop the new window down. You notice that the grid assembly is facing inside towards the cap, and you have just the shiny surface on the outside. We're going to put the clip on. Now notice this clip has got some deposition on the one side, so all we're going to do is we're just going to flip it over so that the other side is facing up. If both sides are dirty, you can use a very fine grit sandpaper or emery cloth to clean it, and then clean that off with some isopropanol. You slide the clip into one end on the back side, either side, it doesn't matter, and then you very, very carefully get these pins, these clips, to slide in under the edge. You can use either a tweezers or you can use an X-Acto knife. It's a little bit tricky because you have to get the clip in without putting a hole in the window. Once you get them in position though, they'll generally slide underneath the lip and the clip will hold the window in place. In this case we have a single clip. On some of the older CMAs that have double pass CMAs, there's also a retainer clip. It's called a collimator clip, and so there's actually 2 clips involved. Now you can see it's kind of hard to get this to go in. It takes a little bit of practice, which again I would recommend you do it a few times with the old window because it's already dirty or already has a hole in it until you get the hang of it. Get that thing popped in carefully without putting a hole in it. See, and just slide that over. And there you go. Now you notice that that clip's not on the right side, it's not all the way over. That's normal. Sometimes they won't fit. As long as it's in tight enough to hold the window, that's the important thing. Now we carefully slide the end cap over. See the grids on the inside facing in, the honeycomb. Carefully slide this over the filaments without touching them. The cap will hold the retainer pins for the filament in place. And now we just have to reinstall these 4 cap head screws. And again, you want them to be snug but not too tight. Tight enough to hold the cap in place, but don't over tighten them or you're going to break them off. And or they'll be difficult to pull out the next time. Alright, so carefully. I like to put all 4 cap head screws into where they're loose or just barely making contact until I get them all 4 in, and then I carefully tighten them. Okay. Finally, we install the 2 3/4 inch filament access flange. Use a new gasket and put anti-seize on the bolts. You'll tighten the bolts firmly on the bench, but once you install the X-ray source on the system, you'll tighten them further. Also check the anode cap head screws once the source is installed on the system because you'll be able to get more torque when it's on the system. Of course, the X-ray source will need to be baked out after this installation because we've had the whole thing apart and it's been exposed to air for some time. And you'll need to follow the outgas and activation procedure for the source per the PHI manual. If you don't have that information, please contact us at rbdinstruments.com. We'll be glad to help you. And congratulations, you have successfully rebuilt your 04548 or 04500 X-ray source.
Brought to you by RBD Instruments.